I'm here with Dr. Richard Scott, GP, after a little bit of absence. He's been away, we've been away, but you are back. Hello, Richard.
Andy, it's true what they say, absence does make the heart grow fonder. So I'm really, really pleased to be back.
Doesn't it just? Right, now, we've been in the last couple of weeks, while you've been away, getting us back into you coming back on air. We looked at something we did almost to the day 1 year ago about caffeine being... I joked about the fact we could have called it caffeine is really, really awesome and God thinks it's brilliant, but that's not quite what we called it.
Very good.
Which should have sums up some of it. That, by the way, is on the podcast and YouTube if you want to listen to that. Now, we're going to talk about bits and pieces. I wanted to quickly go to a question. Now, this was sent in for Anne Lord Jackson, who is my sensory specialist occupational therapist. And this is the question. And she said, "Ooh, I don't know." So she said, "Ask Richard. Whenever I bite into a meringue nest, so egg whites and sugar, if I bite into a meringue nest or a food of a similar texture, it makes me shiver. Why is that?" Now, Anne has not a clue from a sensory perspective, so I thought, let's ask the other specialist, my doctor friend.
I'm laughing because I've never thought of that before. Haven't personally noticed. How very interesting, because I mean it's too quick for a sugar hit to apply, because the sugar hit would have to go into your stomach and be absorbed. Wow, is it because she's anticipating something? Is it a tingle from her teeth? That's the only thing I can imagine. It's a mixture of something like anticipatory, excitement, and literally teeth tingling from biting this thing, giving her a shiver. That's the only thing, those two things I can think of.
Anne came up with nothing from a sensory perspective as an answer for this question. I thought, well, if it's got ice cream on it, maybe that can make you shiver. But no, this is just the meringue
without the ice cream,
similar.
so it can't be the cold element. Somehow your teeth are tingling, but why? Hard to know.
I was thinking sugar rush, but wow, that's a heck of a fast absorption.
Too fast. Much too fast for a sugar hit.
Okay, well, that's great. I can go back to Anne with that one. So if you were the person that asked, why am I shivering when I eat meringue nests? We really don't know. Simple answer.
But if we do come across anything, we'll let you know.
Yes, absolutely. Okay, what have you been up to, Richard, that we wanted to talk about today?
Well, yes, 2 weekends ago, Andy, I went to a mission worship conference. So it's a Christian conference in Eastbourne every year. Particularly aimed at worship leaders, hence the worship bit. So they get some really good bands, and of course the audience sing well, because in theory and in practice, a lot of them are worship leaders. Not everybody. So my wife comes because she loves it as well. There's good teaching as well as the worshipping, and she's not a worship leader. I lead some worship, but what came through this year? There's usually different messages throughout the conference, but there was an overarching theme, which was this: worship changes the atmosphere. So, in other words, when we sing, obviously we're glorifying God, and that's the number one reason we do it. There's a vertical element to it, glorifying God. But worship very much alters the space around us. If you like, there's a horizontal element to other people. And we're going to look at that in just a second. Someone else said this. This is very interesting. Bearing in mind, there's quite a lot of this conference is evangelistic. He said this: worship is our primary calling as Christians, not evangelism, not mission, worship, our relationship to God. And I guess that fits with when Jesus was asked what are the two greatest commandments, and he passed the question back, well, what do you think? Worship the Lord your God with all your heart, mind, and strength. And number two, worship you and look after your neighbor as yourself. If you like, love the Lord your God with all your heart, strength, and love your neighbor as yourself. But worship changes the atmosphere was the theme of the conference. And I thought, okay. And then there was a seminar from a guy called Gator. That was his surname. And he was part of the 24/7 prayer movement. But his element of it was worship. So there's a worship arm to what many people have heard of, the 24/7 prayer movement, where there's prayer 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. And what he was doing was worshipping not just in church, but on the streets. And he was really emphasizing the importance of worshipping on the streets as Christians, and talked about healings talked about people coming to Christ, and others returning to the church who've been away. And I just wanted to give a couple of examples just to encourage people, because these are stories I like to bring. Bearing in mind, we've already talked about how important singing is on a previous time with you, Andy, and how singing is so important to us. It improves us. It really helps us. It's healing for us as individuals. But tonight we're talking about What about other people? Could our singing, could our worship really influence and benefit other people? So here's two stories. They were worshipping on the streets in Croydon High Street, where this guy Gator is from, particularly, is in Croydon. And this woman walked past. She was dressed in a proper suit, really busy. You could tell she was a busy woman. She was striding forward, and she obviously had her mission was to get to her office. And as she walked past the people worshiping on the streets, she stopped as if she could not move. She stopped. She wanted to move forward, and her feet would not move. And she looked round at these people and she said, "What is going on here?" And the guys said, "God is going on here. God has absolutely got hold of you. He's into your heart." And they had a conversation. They don't know what happened in this particular case, which is often not the case. Often people will give their lives there and then. But suddenly this woman, whose life was clearly excessively busy and driven by her business, suddenly encountered God. So that was an interesting experience. Literally, she couldn't move until she'd had a conversation. Even better one was this. I love this story. And you're a guitarist, Andy. I play guitar as well. So they're worshiping on the street somewhere. And there's a man in the corner. How many people do we see sitting on the ground in Tesco's or opposite Tesco's entrance and other places, clearly begging? And he happened to have a guitar next to him. So he's begging and the worship team are nearby. He suddenly picks up his guitar and begins to join in. So they think, oh, that's nice. He's obviously very musical. He can join in with the songs. Not a bit of it. This guy was an ex-worship leader in his own church, and he'd been backslidden, and his whole life had fallen apart to the extent that he was begging. So they invite him up, and he clearly knows the songs. So they stop playing. They get him to play the songs. Carries on, "My Jesus, my Savior," whatever else he's playing. "How great is our God," etc. The next week comes to church, recommits his life to God. His whole life gets back on track. Why? Because these people were worshipping on the streets. So having heard some of these stories, and there was a second seminar about it, I thought, right, I'll join in. So we went on the streets in Eastbourne just to see what would happen on a Saturday. So a couple of Saturdays ago. As we arrive at the place we're going to be worshipping on the streets in Eastbourne, which is actually there's 4 banks within very close succession. So this is a place we're meeting. There's already another church there. A black church is there, worshipping God. So we're thinking, how does this fit in? Well, obviously we fit in with them. So we join in. So suddenly there's 2 lots of churches, the locals, if you like, and us from all different parts of the country, worshipping with them. And there's a microphone. People begin to talk. This woman comes up. Her whole life has fallen apart. And then the last bit of it is her daughter has just emptied her bank account. Total disaster. Gives her life to Christ when she hears about all the wonderful things that God can do for her. Very, very encouraging. Another man comes up to me. "What's going on here? I need to go to church." I said, "You know where to go?" No idea. "Right, you come with us. We're in King's Church in Eastbourne. See you tomorrow morning." Big smile on his face. We could tell more stories, but worship on the streets is what I want to encourage people, that we know that singing is good for us, but today's message is singing is good for other people. It glorifies God, and it's really good for other people. I met another couple before I pass back to Andy in a second. I met another couple, and they're listening to the songs, and I'm watching them, and they're singing away. Oh, I said, "Are you Christians?" "Oh, yeah, we're Christians. We like these songs." "Great. Where do you go to church?" "Well, we actually come from Hastings. We only came down to Eastbourne to do some shopping." And suddenly there they are worshipping God in the street. And I said, "Have you got a worship team in your church, in your brethren church that you've just told me about?" "Oh, yes, we've got a team, but they only ever do stuff in church." I said to them, "Well, number 1, you need to come with your team to this mission conference next year. And number 2, can I suggest your worship team do what's happening here on the streets? Because I'm going to take my worship team in Margate on the streets. I've done some of this stuff before, but not for some time." I was sold on it. So there we go. Here's the message for today to the listeners. Whether you're in America or England or anywhere else, think of 2025 as a new start, a new season. And think of worship in a greater light than before, as more significant than before. It's good for our souls, it's good for our bodies, but I think it's also good for other people, those people outside the church walls. So please, let's be less safe in 2025 than we have been today. And one person mentioned this, Tim Hughes, actually, who was the main speaker, the great worship leader, Tim Hughes, who actually was the main speaker in Mission Worship this year. He said this: we all know about rewilding, how you take areas of the country and, you make sure you plant plants and plant trees and you try to encourage the butterflies and the bees and everything. Rewilding. He says the church needs rewilding. Less safe, more rewilding, and an element of that is let's do some worship on the streets. So I'll stop there. Hand over to Andy. I've got a little bit more I could tell you about, but yeah, rewilding and worship on the streets for 2025.
It's exciting, isn't it?
Mhm.
I actually was a keyboard player. I could never
All
be
right.
bothered with the fingers because I got painful fingers. When you start to play guitar, you're running your fingers up and down the strings. It hurts, and I didn't fancy that.
Very good, very good.
But it's true, isn't it? We looked at singing and we looked at how it does all sorts of things for you physiologically and emotionally and mentally. We looked at all those things for stress and all these things that it benefits. But if it's going to benefit us with what we do, it seems pretty logical to me and not exactly a big leap to think, well, if it's good for me, it's going to be good for somebody else. We all know it's not quite so exciting for us if we're stood next to somebody who's perhaps tonally challenged, shall we say. They can't quite sing the tune. But I remember, I'll tell you, this is the memory that came back. I was setting up a worship group in a church, and there was a guy who was playing the organ, and he wasn't very good. Well, he's rubbish, isn't he, Andy? And I said, no, I don't think so. Well, he's not very good. Well, he's hitting a few bum notes, but yeah. Do you know why he's playing the organ? And this person didn't have a clue. His wife played the organ in this church for 50 years. Because his wife played it, he never played for nearly 50 years. Now his wife's died, there's no organist. He's now stepping up again. I said, when did you last step up and do something you haven't done for 50 years?
Good point. Very good point. Actually, I've heard a couple of things on this. One is that when music, this is someone told me recently, when music goes north to God, even if people who are singing to our ears, oh, this is not great. It's totally wrong. Somehow the music gets transformed en route. So when God hears it, maybe God's doing the transforming, who knows? But when God hears it, it's absolutely pitch perfect. And the second thing is, if we go on the streets, somebody asked a question of this guy in the seminar. Do we all have to be professional worship leaders? Absolutely not. If you do, God will honor what you do. And if this worship comes from your heart, which of course it should do, God will honor what you do. Yes, of course, we want to do it as well as we can, but we're not all Tim Hughes. I can't sing like Tim Hughes or Martin Smith. I sing like me. It's okay. It's not Tim Hughes. But if I honor God, guess what? He'll honor me. And if people listen, they'll be blessed. They'll be blessed with Tim Hughes, Martin Smith or not. They will be blessed.
It's absolutely true. I remember so many times there was one, she was a really good worship leader, this lady. She wasn't the best at singing, and if she stood at the front of a church, she got very nervous. But she was very good leading a church and very good leading a group. So what did we do as a church? We put somebody who was far more confident singing next to her, who could carry a tune, which then set her free to enable her to do other stuff. That was just singing in a church. But there are things we can do. Now, I wanted to touch on this a little bit with you because it sort of comes to mind of when we're talking about singing and it's changing the atmosphere. How would you, do you think, put that into words that are not religious in any sense? I would say that if I'm singing and I can sort of sense the Holy Spirit, which is jargon in itself, sometimes it feels like I can breathe in the Holy Spirit. I've got no better words than that. That's what it feels like. I don't have a better vocabulary. But how would you describe what it is like, as best you can, when we're worshiping? How would you put that into sensible words that I can't?
So do you mean then explaining to people who are listening why we're doing it and what we're saying? Is that what you mean, Andy? Or
yeah,
what?
I'm thinking about people who look at church and say, oh, you're just singing. It's just, you're getting all riled up by it. Of course you are. We have the same at a football match. It's no different.
Good point.
How would you then sort of differentiate and describe worshipping in a Christian context as opposed to 30,000 people at the local football stadium getting a shout on,
or even people singing to Rolling Stones concert or King Crimson or something from the past? Absolutely, yes. Well, I think it's worship that changes the atmosphere. So in other words, what is happening because of Christian songs is very different. It's because the Holy Spirit is in it. And that just changes things. You can't see it, you can't feel it, but a bit like gravity, it's there. You drop a pen, it will fall to the floor because that's what gravity does. If we worship God, people will stop and listen. We had one woman walk past, "There is no God," she shouted. She was one person. Everybody else is looking, thinking, "My goodness, what's going on here?" And some will chat and say, "Wow, there's something is going on here and I want it." So of course it's not going to please everybody, but there is something happening around us which is much greater than ourselves. Now, when 3,000 or even 50,000 at Old Trafford, or in Liverpool, they sing, "You'll never walk alone." That's powerful. But if 50,000 people were singing "How great is our God" or "How great thou art" for an older song, That's infinitely more powerful because God is involved. That's the difference. God is involved. And yeah, it just changes things. And what was lovely is, okay, the Christian music is Christian words, but then people will come on and say a few words just from their own experience. And they kept it really simple and in words that everyone could understand. They, for example, one chap said, years ago, if I'd listened to this, it would have made no sense to me. But my life was in a mess. And this is how God turned it around. And this is the God I'm talking about. Very simple stuff. We can do that. You've got words along those lines. I've got words along those lines. We talk from the heart, and of course, God also gives us the words to say. So it's a different business than a football chant or even a Rolling Stones concert. Very different. Mm.
I would agree completely. I was leading worship from the age of 10 upwards in churches. I was leading worship groups at 15, and there is something quite beautiful about coming not perfect, coming as you are, and then the good things that can happen. My absolute most emotional, distressed state. I walked into church and something terrible had happened. It doesn't matter what it was. I was not emotionally great. And someone said, oh, you need to stop him from leading worship. He's going to be no good for the church tonight. And somebody else said, no, if he's willing to come in broken as he is, and I was, into this place, what can happen? And there were some amazing things that happened that night. Not sort of emotional stuff flying around, but I just came as I was, broken, and said, okay, God, this is my sacrifice. I led the church in worship. And there were some beautiful sounds, some beautiful moments of people interacting with God, which is exactly what you're talking about. It's that woman walking down the street busy who can't carry on.
She was undone. Literally, she was undone. I've got a nice story. I'll throw this in just to add to what we're saying here. So interestingly, there I go to the conference. The next week, I'm reading the Times newspaper, my newspaper, and there was a story in the Times about a Christian wrestler. This is wonderful. Body slamming for Jesus. You'll like this, and this is all about worship.
Is this Gareth Thompson?
I think it might well be Gareth Thompson.
He's a friend, Gaz, yes.
Goodness, so here we are, and you'll know more about it. Terrible start in life, broken home. Father left when he was young. Mother was an alcoholic, sexually abused the boy as a child. He became homeless, age 15, living in a skip. How terrible is that? Can you imagine a cold metal skip? Absolutely terrible. One day, having struggled for years, he gets invited by a friend to church. So this is going to be worship in church. And he said, during worship, I just saw myself sobbing. And some guy came up after us and said, you've just felt love for the first time in your life, and you don't know what to do with it. Andy could add to this in a second. He was totally right. And from that moment on, I tried to figure out faith. Worship changed his life. And he became a wrestler. And now he puts faith and wrestling together in Kingdom Wrestling. And he says, any Christian will tell you that when you go through life, you wrestle with stuff. Very good. You wrestle with your faith. And I feel that wrestling gives us, because there's more than one of him, that opportunity to tell these stories. And he does charity work in schools, men's health, mental health groups, churches, body slamming for Jesus. Andy, tell us more.
He's a lovely guy. I've interviewed Gaz. I met him at the Gathering. He was doing his. He was brought in. He was doing his. He had his ring outside one of the big tops. I absolutely love his heart for what he's doing, and he shared with me in private just some other stories of people who connected with wrestling. For him, it was an escapism as a kid. His grand would have him. He'd watch wrestling, and it was an escape. And he's found the same thing for other guys, other men particularly. But not exclusively, who've sort of seen what he's doing, and it's sufficiently away from the norm that it kind of is interesting to get them in, and then they can have an encounter with Jesus through the worship of what he's doing. It's not singing necessarily, but it's a different form of worship.
Well, I remember watching a group called Tough Talk years ago. You may have come across them. So these are weightlifters. Absolutely. I mean, Commonwealth Games, etc., proper serious weightlifters who become Christians and now weightlift and get the audience to, do some weightlifting, obviously not as heavy. And then when the audience go, wow, I can lift 30 kilos. He's just lifted, 200. Wow, respect. And then he's got their ears and off they go. Fantastic.
I love it. And I'll tell you what I wrote down, which we've got to come back to, is you said, let's be less safe in 2025. And you talked about wilding. We used to live in an area of outstanding natural beauty. Lots of the fields were trimmed down. And there was this one meadow. It hadn't been like destroyed for 100 years or something. It had been protected. When you walk through it, a certain times of year, it's the most beautiful thing in the world to see all these wildflowers. The smells I can't even describe. And it was protected. It would get mowed once a year carefully, and that was it. And it was stunning. Now, lots of the year it was a bit boring when they'd mowed it, but lots of the year it was just growing and you have some. But there were just these few seasons, a few days a year, excuse me, when all the flowers suddenly came out at the same time. The smell, the sight, the colours was just out of this world. And what I'm reminded of is councils who are trying to save money by wilding grass verges. If we stick seeds in them, then we can pretend, hey, this is for the environment, and we can save lots of money because they haven't got to be mown, which is true, and that's a good thing. But actually, it's improving the area because it looks beautiful. Let's be less safe in 2025 with Christianity in churches. What a beautiful nation we would be having if we allowed ourselves to be seen as Christians and not just try to have a little potty plant somewhere that you bring out, a little bit of sun, carefully tended.
Analogy, I like that. Yes. Very good. Very good. So I think the challenge for all of us. It may be worship on the streets. It may be something else, but let's be a bit more wild in 2025. It's coming up soon.
Yeah, we've all got something we can bring. I always bang on about this. The book we wrote is all about this. I absolutely believe we've all got something that God's put in us that we can do with our gifting, with our skills. And it's not just the good stuff. This is like supernatural good stuff. This is beyond I can kick a football. This is I can kick a football for God. It's that sort of a thing. And yeah, be less safe in 2025. If churches stopped, I think I've quoted this before, maybe not, but Jeff Lucas talked about the 10 Commandments. And churches are sitting in their churches. You paint this picture of this church, and they're sitting in their church shouting about how everyone is to follow the 10 Commandments, and they're not doing it themselves. But you said, can you imagine a church where everybody in that church was following those 10 Commandments? Absolutely. The joy that would then start to bubble as a result of that, they wouldn't be having to go out and get people to come to church. People would be knocking on the door because they would see the evidence of something beautiful, just like the wildflowers are there and they're visible.
Point. Yeah. That's a challenge. That is a challenge for us.
Yeah, no, that sort of confidence excites me. I mean, I don't really worship now. I haven't done it for a while, but did it for a very long time. I loved how, if you got out of the way enough, because it's very easy to say, look at me, I'm doing this really well. I go to churches and you've got these singers who are doing all this wonderful, stuff. And it's like, just sing the tune because I can't sing, to keep it simple. And the simple actually is the beautiful. And actually, that's where the good stuff happens when we get out of the way sufficiently. And when I was leading worship and I was able to do that, that's when people had that encounter of God. And like that woman who was marching along to work, when you have that encounter with God, you cannot just walk past it.
Absolutely. Challenge. And an encouragement. It's a challenge, but as all these biblical things are a challenge and an encouragement.
The encouragement is we can make a difference, and it doesn't have to be massively complicated. It can be just grabbing a guitar, going on your high street and having and singing.
Yeah, absolutely. It doesn't have to be plugged in. It doesn't have to be, it can simply be you and the guitar, and preferably one other singer next to you. It's not difficult.
No, and we can make a difference in 2025. Come on, church, let's get this. Let's do something good. We've started a radio station. What have you done recently that's new? Is my thought.
Absolutely.
Richard, it's a joy as ever and always. Thank you. We'll be back for more. If you've got any questions for him, we had one bounced via Anne Lloyd Jackson. If you've got any questions for him on your medical health, you can send them here. hello@pure247radio.org. hello@pure247radio.org. Richard is a GP. If you're not sure what that is because you're not from the UK, that is a family practitioner in the States. Richard, my friend, thank you.
And until next time, great to be back.